Mason Reed was checking his fence line when he saw the burlap sack floating down Miller's Creek. He thought it was just old rags, but then a tiny hand reached out, and a voice, barely louder than a whisper, said a single word that would change everything. Mama. What he pulled from that sack wasn't just a secret. It was a miracle that would bring a whole town to its knees. The morning sun was just a rumor over the Texas hills when Mason Reed saddled his horse, Thunder. It was the start of another long day, same as all the others. Check the posts. Mend the wire. At 45, Mason had been doing this for a decade. Ever since the fire. The fire that took his wife, Emily, and their baby boy. After that, Mason just stopped. He worked hard. He kept to himself. And he never, ever thought about what could have been. He was a tall man with hands like worn leather, and eyes that held too much pain. The other ranch hands gave him space. They knew about the walls he'd built around his heart. Walls so thick, nothing could ever get through again. Or so he thought. He was riding along the creek when he saw it. A bundle caught in the current. He figured it was just trash, but something made him stop. It was a burlap feed sack, tied shut, and it was moving. He swung down from Thunder and waded into the cold water. The sack was heavy. As he pulled it from the creek, he heard it. A sound so faint it was almost nothing. A whimper. A cry so weak it could have been the wind. His hands started to shake. He fumbled with the wet rope. He pulled it loose, and what he saw inside that sack would haunt him for the rest of his days. A baby girl, maybe 9 months old. Matted blonde hair, lips blue from the cold. Her little body was like ice. She was barely breathing. But she was alive. She opened her eyes. She looked right at him. And then she whispered it, the word that shattered his heart into a million pieces. Mama. For a second, Mason couldn't move. He just stood there in the creek, holding a dying child, seeing the ghost of his own son. But this was different. This time, he could do something. He ripped off his heavy coat, wrapped her in it, and scrambled back onto his horse. He'd never ridden so fast in his life. The baby was getting weaker. Her breath was a tiny, shallow puff against his chest. He pressed her close, trying to force his own warmth into her. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just hold on." Her tiny fingers grabbed a piece of his shirt. A flicker of a fight in a body that had none left. As he galloped toward town, his mind was on fire. Who does this? What kind of monster puts a baby in a sack and throws her in a creek? But there was no time for questions. There was only time to get to Doc Stone. The baby's eyes fluttered closed. Mason's heart stopped. He thought he was too late. But then, she took another shallow breath. Her little hand tightened its grip. She was still fighting. People on Main Street stopped and stared as the wild-eyed cowboy raced past, clutching a strange bundle to his chest. Mason saw nothing but the doctor's office at the end of the street. He slid off Thunder before the horse even stopped and ran for the door. He pressed his ear to the coat. He could feel her breath, a tiny flicker of warmth. She was alive. She had to make it. Because in the last 20 minutes, this little girl had already started to mend a part of Mason's heart he thought was buried forever. But as he burst through that door, Mason had no idea he wasn't just saving a life. He was starting a war. A war against the most powerful family in town, and a secret that could burn them all to the ground. Dr. Michael Stone looked up from his coffee as Mason Reed crashed into his office. The cowboy's face was ghost white. "Doc, you gotta help," Mason gasped. "I found her in the creek. She's barely breathing." Doc Stone had seen it all in his 20 years of practice. But when Mason laid the tiny, blue-lipped baby on the examination table, even his seasoned gut clenched. "Get her on the table now," he commanded. Mason's big, rough hands were surprisingly gentle as he smoothed her wet hair. The baby whimpered, a sound that cut right through both men. "How long was she in the water?" Doc Stone asked, already grabbing warming blankets. "I don't know," Mason said, his voice thick. She was tied in a feed sack, floating like garbage. The next hour was the longest of Mason's life. Doc Stone worked like a man possessed, fighting for every breath the baby took. He wrapped her, checked her heart, searched for injuries. Mason paced the floor like a caged wolf. "She's hypothermic," the doctor said. "Dangerously low body temperature, dehydrated. But she's a fighter, I can tell." That's when Grace Harper walked in. The 35-year-old schoolteacher was just passing by when she heard the commotion. Grace was a kind woman who kept to herself. She'd lost her husband in a mining accident 5 years ago. What most people didn't know was that she'd also lost a baby daughter to fever. 6 months old. She had sworn she would never hold another child again. "Dr. Stone?" she asked, poking her head in. Then she saw the baby. Her hand flew to her throat. She couldn't breathe. The child was so small, so helpless, just like her own little girl. "Grace, thank goodness," the doctor said. "I need your help. This baby needs constant care. You're the only woman in town I trust." Grace wanted to run. Every part of her screamed to turn around and leave before her heart shattered all over again. But then the baby opened her eyes and looked right at her. Grace felt something inside her, something she thought was dead and buried, stir to life. "What happened to her?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Someone threw her in Miller's Creek to die," Mason growled from the corner. The baby was stabilizing, her breathing getting stronger. But Doc Stone was right. She needed round-the-clock care. He couldn't do it alone. And Mason, with his shaking hands, was terrified of doing something wrong. Before she could stop herself, Grace heard herself say the words, "I'll help." When Dr. Stone placed the baby in her arms, something incredible happened. The child, who had been restless and whimpering, went still. She calmed instantly. Her tiny hand wrapped around Grace's finger. She made a soft, cooing sound that was the most beautiful thing Grace had ever heard. Mason watched, stunned, as Grace started to hum a lullaby. A real smile touched the baby's lips for the first time. It was tiny, but it was enough to bring tears to both their eyes. "She likes you," Mason said softly. For the next 3 days, Mason and Grace became a team. The grieving cowboy and the heartbroken schoolteacher, united by a child who wasn't theirs. They took turns. Mason learned how to change diapers. Grace showed him how to test formula on his wrist. They barely spoke, both terrified of getting too attached. But as the baby grew stronger, the walls between them started to crumble. "I had a daughter once," Grace admitted one night. "She would have been 5 now. I lost a son," Mason said quietly. "House fire. I thought I'd never want to be around children again. But this little one, she's different." The baby finished her bottle and reached up, her tiny fingers touching a tear on Grace's cheek. It was Grace who gave her a name. "We can't keep calling her the baby," she said. "She's been through the worst this world has to offer, and she's still fighting. She's still hoping." Mason smiled, a real smile, the first in years. "Hope," he repeated. "I like that." Hope seemed to like it too. She started to thrive. Dr. Stone called it a miracle. It was like she knew she was loved. But just as Mason and Grace were starting to feel like a real family, Sheriff Williams burst through the door, and the news he brought made their blood run cold. "Someone's been asking questions," the sheriff said, his face grim. "About a missing baby. They're offering a $1,000 reward for information." He looked at them, his eyes serious. "Whoever abandoned this child, they're looking for her." Sheriff Williams sat down, his face a mask of concern. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "Someone deliberately put that baby in the creek, and now they're trying to cover their tracks." Mason's jaw was a hard line. Grace pulled Hope closer, her body a shield. "They're not getting her," she whispered. "We don't know who they are yet," the sheriff said. "All I know is, Mayor Thornton's assistant came by my office, asked if anyone had found a missing infant, said it was a family matter that needed to be handled quietly." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Mayor Richard Thornton, the wealthiest, most powerful man in 3 counties. He owned the bank, the biggest ranch, half the town. When Thornton wanted something, it got done. No questions asked. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a conspiracy at the highest level. Word got around town about Mason and Grace. Some folks thought it was sweet. Most whispered about the unmarried man and woman raising a child that wasn't theirs. "Let them talk," Mason would say, but the worry was plain in his eyes. Their little family was built on a foundation of love, but it had no legal ground to stand on. The truth came from Maria Gonzalez, the mayor's housekeeper. She found Grace at the schoolhouse, her hands twisting in her apron, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot stay quiet," she whispered. "That baby. She belongs to Miss Rebecca, the mayor's daughter." Grace's world tilted. Rebecca Thornton was 19, the town's golden girl. She'd been sent away to visit relatives 6 months ago. "Rebecca had a baby?" Grace asked, but she already knew the answer. Maria nodded. The family. They were so ashamed. A baby with no husband. It would ruin their name. The story got darker with every word. The mayor had told his own daughter that her baby died at birth. Rebecca had grieved for weeks, never knowing her child was alive. Then, the mayor paid a man to take care of the problem. "I heard them," Maria sobbed. "They said the baby would be better off dead than growing up with the shame. So they threw Hope in the creek to die, and now they wanted her back, before anyone could connect the abandoned baby to their precious family name." "They're not taking her," Grace said, her voice like steel. "Over my dead body," Mason agreed. But they both knew what they were up against. Mayor Thornton owned the town, and they had nothing but love. And sometimes love isn't enough. Hope was thriving. She called Grace Mama now. She would pat Mason's cheek and babble Papa. She was healing them, even as they healed her. But that evening, as Grace tucked Hope into her crib, she saw the mayor's fancy carriage rolling down Main Street. The fight for Hope was no longer a possibility. It was here, and it was about to get ugly. Mayor Richard Thornton strode into Doc Stone's office like he owned it. He was a big man with silver hair and eyes as cold as a banker's heart. Behind him, looking thin and pale, was his daughter, Rebecca. Mason stood up, placing himself between the Thorntons and Grace, who was holding Hope. The baby, sensing the tension, stopped playing and stared. "Mr. Reed," the mayor boomed, "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." "I have a baby that was left to die in a creek," Mason shot back. "If she belongs to anyone, it's the people who saved her." The mayor's eyes flashed. He wasn't used to being challenged. "That child is my granddaughter. She will have a proper upbringing with all the advantages my money can provide." Hope whimpered and buried her face in Grace's shoulder. "She doesn't know you," Grace said quietly. "She's afraid." Rebecca stepped forward. May I hold her?" Grace hesitated, then slowly moved toward Rebecca. But as she tried to hand the baby over, Hope started to scream. A desperate, terrified wail. She reached for Grace, her little fists grabbing Grace's dress. "Mama! Mama!" she sobbed. Rebecca's face crumpled. "She doesn't know me," she whispered, her heart breaking. She turned on her father, her eyes blazing with pain and anger. "You told me she died. You let me grieve for months." "I did what was best for this family," the mayor snapped. "A scandal would have ruined us." He turned his cold gaze on Mason and Grace. "But we can fix this. The child will come home with us. I've already spoken with Judge Parker. Family rights will supersede any temporary arrangements." "You threw this baby away like garbage," Mason said, his voice rising with rage. "You paid someone to kill her. Now you want her back to protect your reputation." "She's not property," Grace added, her voice shaking. "She's a little girl who is loved." "Love?" the mayor scoffed. "Living in poverty? I can give her a mansion, private tutors, the finest clothes." "She has love," Grace repeated. "That's worth more than all your money." Rebecca looked at her crying daughter, then back at her father. The choice was tearing her apart. "This is getting us nowhere," the mayor said, pulling a legal document from his coat. "Judge Parker will hear this case in 3 days. I suggest you enjoy your remaining time with the child." As they left, Rebecca looked back one last time. "I love you," she whispered to the daughter who didn't know her. Hope, now quiet, just stared back with curious blue eyes. That night, as Grace rocked Hope to sleep, a terrifying thought took root. They were going to lose. The law, the money, the power. It was all on the mayor's side. But then Grace remembered something. A secret she had kept for 2 years. A secret about Rebecca. A secret about the bruises she had seen on the girl's arms. A secret about a terrified teenager begging for help. And suddenly Grace knew they had one last card to play. A card that could save them all, or get them killed. The courtroom was packed. The whole town had turned out to see the cowboy and the school teacher go up against the mayor. Judge Parker, a fair man, banged his gavel for order. The mayor's expensive lawyer from Dallas made his case. It was simple. Blood was blood. The baby belonged with her family. He painted a picture of a tragic misunderstanding. Then Tom Bradley, Mason and Grace's lawyer, stood up. "Your Honor, this misunderstanding nearly killed a child. My clients saved her, loved her, and have become her true parents." As if on cue, Hope looked up at Grace and said, clear as a bell, "Mama." Rebecca was the first witness. She told the court how she had grieved for the daughter she thought was dead. But on cross-examination, she had to admit the truth. "She cried," Rebecca sobbed. "She didn't want me to hold her. She called the other woman Mama. My own daughter doesn't know me." Mason took the stand next. "Your Honor, I know I'm just a ranch hand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I know what it means to love a child. I lost my son 10 years ago. I thought that part of my heart was dead. Then I found Hope. She calls me Papa now. And every time she does, it fills a hole I thought would never be healed." Grace's testimony was the most powerful. She spoke of her own lost daughter, and how Hope had brought her back to life. Then she looked straight at Mayor Thornton, and she dropped the bombshell. "Your Honor, I taught Rebecca in school. I know why she was so afraid. 2 years ago she came to me covered in bruises. Her father had been hitting her, controlling her. She was terrified to tell anyone because of his power in this town." The courtroom exploded. The mayor leaped to his feet, screaming, "Lies!" But Rebecca was sobbing, nodding her head. "It's true," she whispered. "He hit me when I told him about the baby. He called me a disgrace." Grace pressed on. "I'm offering to help Rebecca now, just as I did then. To help her become the mother she wants to be. Not just a piece of property for her father's reputation." Judge Parker called for a recess. As the room began to empty, something amazing happened. Hope, who had been getting fussy, wriggled down from Grace's lap. She stood, wobbling, on her own 2 feet. And with the entire courtroom watching, she took her first steps, straight into Mason's outstretched arms. "Papa!" she squealed. "Papa!" The courtroom fell silent. A baby had just chosen her family. But the law was the law, and the judge's decision would determine if this was a beginning or a heartbreaking end. Judge Parker returned to his bench. The room was so quiet you could hear a heartbreak. "I have been a judge for 30 years, he began, his voice heavy. "And I have never seen a case that so clearly shows the difference between what is legal and what is right." He looked at Mayor Thornton. "The law says blood relatives have rights, but the law also says we must act in the best interest of the child." He let the words hang in the air. "I've heard testimony about abandonment and abuse, but I've also seen a baby take her first steps toward the people she calls Mama and Papa." His voice grew strong. "This court finds that Hope belongs with Mason Reed and Grace Harper. They have provided her with love, stability, and security. More importantly, she has chosen them." The courtroom erupted. Mayor Thornton screamed, "Outrageous!" But no one was listening. Rebecca, however, was crying tears of relief. She walked over to Grace. "May I say goodbye?" she asked. She leaned down to Hope. "I love you, Emma," she whispered, using the name she'd given her. "I want you to be happy more than I want you to be with me." She looked at Mason and Grace. "I want to be part of her life." if you'll let me. Not as her mother, but as someone who loves her." "Of course," Grace said, taking her hand. 6 months later, the whole town gathered for Mason and Grace's wedding. Hope was the flower girl. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, she shouted, "Mama, Papa!" and the whole church laughed. Years passed. Hope grew into a bright, confident child who knew her story. When people asked who her real parents were, she'd point to Mason and Grace. "They are," she'd say. "They chose me." Rebecca became Aunt Rebecca, a beloved part of their lives. Mayor Thornton lost his power and respect, and lived out his days a bitter, lonely man. The man he'd hired to get rid of Hope was arrested, his conscience having eaten him alive. On Hope's 5th birthday, surrounded by everyone who loved her, she was asked to make a wish. She looked around the room at her family, her mama, her papa, her Aunt Rebecca. "I don't need to," she said. "I already have everything." What began with a cowboy finding a sack in a creek ended with a family proving that love is always stronger than blood. If you believe a family is made of love, not just laws, hit that subscribe button. Because we've got more stories coming that will make you believe in the power of hope all over again.